Rescue California. My name is Kelly Brothers. Glad to be with you. Partner in Genevieve Burford Brothers. Also do a little TV and radio work. But today, I'm just a concerned taxpayer like the rest of you. And very happy to be here and help lead us through a few panel discussions. We got a great keynote speaker. We're going to hear from the godfather of taxpayer rights as well. But why don't we begin? And if you don't mind, why don't we stand up and pledge allegiance to our flag? I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you all very much. Great pleasure to introduce the man who is the founder of the National Tax Limitation Committee, the godfather of all rights having to do with taxpayers. And it's great to see him looking so hale and hearty. Please give a warm welcome to Lou Euler. Come on up, Lou.
Thank you, Kelly, and all of you for taking time out of your very busy schedules to join us and drive a stake in the ground for the future of California. We have several legislators who are to be with us at some point. I don't know that any have arrived as yet. Nope. Okay. So let us welcome and recognize some of the folks who have made this occasion possible. And we'll start with those who are our sponsors and table sponsors. Rob Lapsley and the California Business Roundtable, Rex Heim and the Business Owners, Property Owners Association over here, Patrick Miller with the Chamber, Stan Van Vleck, Angelo G. Tacopoulos. Where is he? Angelo is right there. Good. Paul Minnie with the Charter School Group. I don't know if Paul is here. Dave Lucchetti, Mike McSay, Brad Dacus, Rob Cord. I know Rob is here. Rob, where are you? There he is, down there. Dan Dunmoyer, I know Dan is here. Hold up your hand, Dan. We'll hear from you a little bit later. Sam Paredes of the Gun Owners of California, and Lance Hastings with the California Manufacturers and Technology Association. And I'm reminded that we also have some local elected officials. I think Susan Frost is here. There she is. Thank you, Susan. And our son Kirk, the supervisor from Placer County, is here. And just a little vignette, when we came up here, next year it'll be 50 years ago from the San Gabriel Valley to join a fellow by the name of Ronald Reagan and my old Bolt Hall Law School classmate, Ed Meese, who was his assistant at the time. And so we came up, and Kirk was all of 3 years of age. And one of the early things for families to do was to go and view the Auburn Dam overlook, where you were watching the base of the Auburn Dam being constructed. So we took the family there, and we saw this magnificent thing that was coming into being. And in 50 years, they haven't been able to create the damn thing. And we had 20 million people at that time. We're getting closer to 40 million. And we haven't built one dam or reservoir in that entire time period. Now, do we need to rescue California or not? And we drove up here on exquisite roads and got into very positive and adequate schools. And if you've driven statewide on our roads recently, you know they're not exquisite things to drive on. And that's another reason we've got to rescue California. I want to introduce a couple of other people who are not table sponsors, but are great folks in the history of this crazy state of ours. One of them I just ran across the other day and invited him. And he was Ronald Reagan's chief of security and staff and protected him in Washington and is his happy companion on El Cielo, the Reagan Ranch, Dennis LeBlanc. Dennis, where are you? And we've got great people like John Kabatek, you'll hear from soon with NFIB, Jim Burling, the director of litigation for the Pacific Legal Foundation. We've got a couple of people who just this weekend published some great stuff on California. One is Tom Del Baccaro. Tom. And he's on Fox News and does all kinds of good things. And over the weekend, Capital Political Review reprinted from Forbes his article, The Top 4 Reasons California is Unsustainable. So you laid the groundwork on Saturday. And folks can go and read this. It's great stuff. And then by golly, not to be outdone, is John Kupal, the head of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, who succeeded in having a great op-ed in the Orange County Register on Sunday. California's budget process has devolved into a bad joke. And I think we all agree with that. And it reminds me of my time with Reagan. We did several things, but the key was Proposition 1 here in California that we ran with in 1973. We lost narrowly. It was to put a limit on the state expenditures on a year-by-year basis. But then, thank goodness, Paul Gann and Howard got together, and in June of 1978, succeeded in passing our great Prop 13 for California. And I went to Paul afterwards and said, Paul, you've got the name recognition that we need to go back and get the right kind of limitation for spending in California. And Paul said yes. And we got the Gann limit passed with a 3/4 vote in November of 1979, and that ran us perfectly for about 10 years until Props 98 and 111 were approved that changed that whole outcome. So we've been on a roller coaster ride in California in terms of developing the right control devices and then unfortunately messing with them and abandoning them. But now with what Jack Frost has brought to me last year, the Pro Small Biz California proposal, and what we're looking at now and what we're putting together and what has prompted this get together today is that we're going to revamp and restructure and help rebuild a conservative political base of business owners and business employees using the model of the BIPAC, Business and Industry Political Action Committee of the U.S. Chamber, where they have established the premise that the single most influential person in the life of most voters is their employer. And we're going to reach out to those employees, recruit them, train them, get them activated, because their future is on the line as to whether or not their business can survive or be driven out of the state of California. So that's why we're all here. That announces the future that we're going to try to bring about. And believe me, if it is demonstrated to work here in California in selected parts of our state. We will take it national. We will go to those 30 to 40 congressional districts and states where we need to have this kind of change occur. And that's going to be aiding the future of the entire USA. So those are the stakes. That's why you're here. And thank you for being here. Thank you for taking the time to commit to making this state great, rescuing it for the future, for our children and our grandchildren, and now for my great-grandson, little Clayton, who's just 3 years old. So thank to each and every one of you for what you're doing and where we're headed. Thank you.
Let's hear it for Lou. Way to go, Lou. All right, time to bring up the man who's the president of Pro Small Business California. Let's hear it for Jack Frost. Come on up, Jack.
Wow, I've been losing a lot of sleep over this event, and I'm amazed at the crowd that we've got. Thank you all for taking time out. We were not quite sure when we picked the day and the time whether people would come out at that time, but we were thinking, 4:15, 4:30, those folks across the way would be a little bit hungry and a little bit thirsty, and we could get them to come, but they didn't come. Or maybe there's a few of them out there that came. But I think a lot of people came that are really concerned about the topics that we're going to be talking about today. And just to make sure that you're in the right event, if you thought you were coming to an event where we were going to talk about the Republican or the Democrat Party, you're in the wrong room. This is not about politics. This is about pro-business. The litmus test for Pro Small Biz California is very simple. It's either good for business or it's not good for business. And it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on across the street, you better be on the side of business, because if you're not, you're going to hear from us, because we're building an army of pro small biz advocates. So we're going to build an army. There's a couple of things that every army needs. And if you think about the two most important things that every army needs, one of them is rations. Got to keep the troops healthy. And they need bullets. And we need you to help us fund those bullets and those rations. So on your table, there's a one-page doc. That's the back and forth document. It's a two-sided document. On one side, there's an article from Steve Frank that he did about what we're trying to do, kind of a summary. You'll learn a little bit more about Pro Small Biz California from that article. And on the other side, it'll give you some information if you want to donate, $5, $10, $25. When you have an army, you only need each soldier to do a little bit in order to make a big difference. And so we're hoping that we can get a whole lot of people to help us with just a little bit. And it's going to mean a lot. So California, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, and I learned this when I was promoting cord blood stem cell legislation back in Washington, D.C. Sacramento is the most diverse area, metropolitan area in the entire country. And California is the most diverse state in the country. So here's a statistic I learned from NFIB. About a year ago, I was at an NFIB State of the Capitol Legislative Day, and I learned that if you add up all the businesses, all the small businesses that are owned in California by a combination of African American, Hispanic, Asians, and families from India, you're at 49%. Half of the small businesses in the state of California are owned by the minority communities. I'm not sure but I don't think that a majority of the minority communities are paying attention to the way their legislators are voting. Because I think if they knew how they were voting, they'd be pretty upset because they're not voting pro-business, and they need to be voting pro-business. So at a time when we're enjoying the strongest economy that I think anybody in this room can ever remember, certainly the lowest unemployment that we've ever had in California, at that time, at a time when half of our businesses are owned by the minority community, and we're a very diverse population. Why are businesses leaving California at the highest rate ever recorded? Of course, we all know the answer to that question, but what we want to try to do with Pro Small Business California is to figure out a solution so that those businesses won't want to stay here. So we came up with the idea, who has the most skin in the game? The skin in the game are the business owners and their employees. I used to have a company with 54 employees, and we didn't have anybody advocating for us. We were a small business. We couldn't afford a cadre of lawyers or lobbyists. So the voices of those folks need to be educated. They need to understand the intersection between business and politics. And so we're going to educate them, and we're going to do it with a number of different tools. And the tools we're going to be using are going to be a newsletter. And speaking of a newsletter, there's another document on your table. It looks kind of like this. Everybody needs to get their name, their phone number, and their cell phone number if they want to be able to get access to text message alerts. The Bottom Line newsletter will be it'll be launching sometime next month. It's going to have a whole bunch of great information about what's going on and that might affect your 401k. It'll have legislative updates. It's going to have articles by a lot of the people that are in this room that write on a regular basis about issues that affect their business community. So it'll be one of the educational tools. We're going to start workshops, and the workshops are going to be an opportunity for employers and their employees to start learning about how they can become engaged. And one of the tools is going to be a mobile app. In fact, NFIB already has a mobile app. But imagine how convenient it would be if you could pull your phone out and go to your mobile app and put your address in the phone, and up pops the names of every one of your elected officials. And then, we have to make sure we understand how they're voting. And how do we determine if they're pro-business? Well, we do that by looking at their fingerprints. And how do you imagine we get their fingerprints? We get their fingerprints from NFIB and Howard Jarvis because they have the voting record of every single legislator. And the voting record tells us immediately whether they're voting in our best interest or not. So imagine an app that can just deliver that information right here. And the ability for us to update them on the legislative bills that are in the queue. Get them over across the street to testify. Have them show up at the district office or the Capitol office to raise a little bit of cane or hell, whichever you prefer. So those are the tools that we're planning on utilizing. You've got on the backside of the agenda are a list of all the sponsors, and Lou went through most of them. But I want to do a special shout out for a couple of organizations that have really done a lot to help us. They supported us in our first event at the Dante Club in October. Tina and Terry Shaw are the owners of Signs in One Day. And almost every one of you in this room needs signs, you need banners, things like that. They're very huge supporters of our veteran community. So if you need a sign or you need a banner, you need something along those lines, remember Signs in One Day in Citrus Heights, Terry and Tina Shaw. I also want to give a huge shout out to Ray Reilly in Citrus Heights with A Applied Mailings. In addition to doing mailings, a lot of you communicate through mailings, both political and business types of mailings. and all kinds of printing. A lot of the printing that's on your tables today was made available through Ray. Ray, you're here. Stand up and take a bow. If you need printing or mailing services, he's the guy that you want to go to. The other special shout out I want to give is to Eric Blue. Eric is got a team of people here that are doing Facebook Live as we speak. They're also going to be filming this. We're doing interviews. We're going to be putting all this stuff up on YouTube. Eric runs a real estate roundtable in the multifamily university. And let's give a round of applause to Eric and the team that he brought to the table to help make this possible. Then real quickly, a couple of events that are coming up. Most of you have heard about the Dynamex problem. It's the biggest problem going on in California right now. It's the new law that changes the definition of self-employed. It's going to affect over 2 million self-employed individuals in California. We're going to be doing a multi-chamber event to help all the businesses understand and how they're going to be able to cope with. AB 5 is the piece of legislation that will be codifying the Supreme Court decision. So that'll be coming up next. We're planning an event at the Reagan Library sometime maybe in September with Art Laffer, and that'll be about the single-payer healthcare issue and Medicare for all, which are two things we need to make sure don't happen. That's going to take all of our private insurance away. We can't let that happen. And then at the end of the year, we're going to be doing an event on private and public pensions, and that'll be in San Diego. So those are the three events that we have coming up. The last thing that I want to mention is, I don't know about you, but I've been awake at nights wondering what's going to happen when the older generation, like my generation, fade off into the sunset. Who is going to keep America great? And so this is what I'd like to do. I'd like to have the young generation of young professionals that took the time out of their busy schedule to come out and support this event. These two tables, would you guys stand up and take a bow? So we want you to know we're leaving this country in pretty good hands. They're starting to figure it out. Some of these folks represent the newest Turning Point USA chapter at CSUS. So we've got a lot of passion coming from the younger generation, and they're the ones that are going to have to figure out how to solve the Social Security problem, because none of them believe it's going to be there for them. In fact, some of us are wondering if it's going to hang in there long enough for us. So, and then one last thing. For those of you that parked in the Hyatt parking garage, if you didn't get a ticket, get one on your way out. It's kind of a chaser ticket for those of you that haven't used it before. You put your regular ticket in first, then you put the other ticket in, and that brings the price down to $11. And we wanted to be able to do that to help you all out. So thank you all for coming. So excited. We have a great panel for you. And thanks for coming.
Thank you, Jack Frost. All right, before we have panels, we have two panels. We have a keynote speaker. So it's my great pleasure to bring up to speak today the first president and CEO of the Greater Sacramento Economic Council. Barry was the first to establish a public-private partnership economic development organization led by the CEOs of great businesses and the state of California. 44 CEOs, 20 communities in the greater Sacramento region. He really led the way in helping everyone understand that this is a regional effort and we shouldn't be working against each other. We should be looking at this as a region that maybe goes far beyond the boundaries that any of us thought. He has been featured for his work in global and national media outlets. Maybe you've seen him in the Times, Bloomberg, Forbes. Just today, I saw Barry quoted in The Economist when I was looking up a few stories earlier this afternoon. More than anything else, though, about Barry, I'm a native Sacramentan, and proudly so. And I'll tell you one thing about being a Sacramentan is we didn't exactly know who we were or what we wanted to be. Did we want to be a big city? Did we want to stay a small town? We actually all just wanted the best of both worlds, didn't we? And Barry came in here from an area outside Sacramento and in 6 months had figured out a way to articulate who we are and what we had to offer the rest of the business world. And I thought it was just, he did an unbelievable job of synthesizing a lot of information in a very short amount of time and is now really our voice to the rest of the business world. Please give a warm welcome to Barry Broom.
Okay, this is an exciting time. We're going to turn this around in California. Let's get excited about it. Let's be positive. Let's think this way. I'm sitting here listening to your story about Ronald Reagan, so I'm going to give you a quick story because it was just kind of funny. So when I was in Arizona, I became friends with John McCain. And he was a very interesting guy. He used to have a saying, you know, government matters, just not that much. And of course, you know, coming from a libertarian state now to California, needless to say, you know, it was quite shocking to do so, but I'm happy to be here. So one time I got invited to travel with John. This unrelated anecdotal story, I thought you'd get a kick out of it. And of course, he had already run for president. This was a few years ago. And I was traveling with he and Dr. Michael Crow from Arizona State. So, you know, basically, you know, I was his, you know, valet. You know, I carried all of his stuff. My core competency was taking pictures of him with other people. And, you know, watching John walk through the airport was exciting. And I was a big fan of his. He was a really good man. And we got on the airplane Southwest after John argued for 30 minutes over the $45 fee to sit in the A section, of which I told him, you know, please leave the employee alone. She knows who you are, and she doesn't run Southwest Airlines. But that's the way John was. He was like purple over $45, you know. So we got on the plane, we flew, and John was sitting there with Michael Crow, who's the president of Arizona State, and you know they're talking about the Middle East and all these amazing things going on. And fortunately for me, in my seat was a People magazine. And Brad Pitt and Angelina was going through a divorce, so I think this was 2013. So I had something to do while they talked about world affairs. And so this nice lady walks up and she leans over and she shakes John's hand and she said, I want to thank you for everything you've done for this country. And he said, I appreciate it. And she turned to me and she said, and I want to thank you for everything you've done for our country. And I went, well, you are welcome. And she said, are you married? I said, I am. She goes, do you have children? I said, I do. I have 3 kids. And she said, my gosh, your wife must lie awake at night and worry like crazy over this dangerous job you have. She thought it was John's bodyguard, like I was thinking. Meanwhile, if you knew McCain's personality, it was just like you saw on TV. McCain's now circling around looking at me, right? We're sitting in this little A section. And I said, well, you know, after all these years, she's gotten used to it, you know? So she shakes my hand and goes back, and John's still looking at me, and I put my arm around him. I said, John, you know I'd take a bullet for you. So I just thought that was a cute story. Triggered in my mind. So, I really feel like we can win this fight. I really do. If the debate is framed properly and the work is properly done, because, you know, the irony of all of these different policies that had certain objectives, whether it was to help the poor or the disadvantaged, you know, I think we know by now in California, it's the poorest Californians that are paying the biggest price for this. Losing their jobs when companies out-migrate, not having access to housing, not having access to quality schools like all of us had. And, you know, I always find that ironic when I have these conversations with people. Who's paying the price? One of the first things that I did in this community when I came here was our regional transit system had been run in the ground. And I mean to tell you, it was disgraceful. Not just that it got ran in the ground, but the lack of oversight, the mismanagement of public funds, so few questions asked on the behavior. I mean, it was astonishing. It was shocking. And when we replaced the leadership, brought in a new leader. His name's Henry Lee. He's done a great job with it, cleaned it up. You know, what I really found out, and we can give Henry a little bit of applause, yeah. So in the first year, Henry's a good conservative manager. He extended the services and cut $20 million out of the operating budget. And I said, that just shows you how mismanaged this asset was, because there's too much public money in California. There's so much money into these institutions, they don't have to operate like enterprises. They don't have to pay attention to services. There's so many of them and so little oversight that it's hard to keep an eye on them, because what should be a small enterprise ends up having tremendous sums of money. And when I was in the process, my ally in cleaning this up was the union. Why was the union my ally? Because they were the ones with the workers making $22 an hour that was going to get laid off because of the shortages. The management team retired, took their 30 plus, right? Plus COLA, plus healthcare for the next 25 years, moved out of the state, kept their, stopped paying taxes in California. And we were left with a broken system whose primary responsibility was to move disadvantaged people, for the most part, to and from their services and needs. And yet it was run and ground by the very people who were sworn by values and by politics to uphold that. And I've seen that again and again in our own community as we've worked through our own cycle. And then when I look at the country, I'm from Ohio. So when people look at, the revolution that's occurred in Washington, D.C. and nationally, and they scratch their head, you don't have to be from Ohio to understand where that revolution came from, or West Virginia, or Indiana, or one other state where generation after generation watched the deterioration of their economy, the deterioration of schools. I grew up in Ohio. Ohio is now the opiate capital of the United States of America. And there is no community or no family that's inundated by opiate addiction. When I grew up in Ohio, it was middle America. Everybody had a job, good schools, middle income. It's really the neglect of policy and the neglect of leadership and the inability to see other people that allowed that to deteriorate. And when I look at us right now in California, I really look at our state, and I'm just mesmerized by how tone deaf our state leadership is on the challenges that are at our feet, the trajectory of the state, and the threats that are upon us. And the problem with sustainability is it's amazing how long you can go in an unsustainable fashion. And when you find out you weren't sustainable, let me tell you, you find out really quick, really fast, really hard, and no one in this country has recovered. Cleveland has not recovered. It's 50 out of 50 cities in economic well-being. Detroit has not recovered. Flint can't even drink the water. Chicago's getting ready to spiral out of control. That's what I always considered the greatest American city. Great blue-collar jobs, great middle-income jobs, great schools, parks, affordabilities, elite corporate executive jobs, corporate towers in the downtown, great transit system. They're more than on the ropes. So when I talk about two folks in California, I always remind them, I'm a car guy out of Ohio and Michigan. I was an economic developer there 17 years, and that's how I became an economic developer. My dad lost his job when I was 16, and he essentially never got another job. World War II Marine, loses a job at 46, 8th grade education because he went to the war, came back, got married, had a bunch of kids, and spent his life doing odd jobs because there was no job coming back. So sometimes when you choose a profession like what I choose, sometimes there's a personal story. But one of my stories on sustainability is General Motors. So in 1973, there was a story called Generous Motors. It's a famous story now in the Midwest. And it talked about the labor agreement that General Motors entered into the United Auto Workers. It's about 1972, 1973. And the story was, how can General Motors sustain themselves with this labor agreement? So when I was working in economic development in Michigan, for every 4 employees at General Motors, 1 was at work and 3 was at home collecting almost 100% of their income on a pension. That's right. That's right. And in 1998, that was the last major project I did with General Motors. We did this major powertrain facility. And I was working with an investment banker. It was about an $800 million investment. What General Motors would do is it would flow its credit to its supply chain. This is how powerful a balance sheet General Motors had in 1998. Not only would it build its own $1 billion factory, but it would lend the security to the 15, 20 suppliers so they could get price preferences on machinery, equipment, and buildings. And that was kind of the economic model you did in the industrial Midwest. You landed the big OEM, you built out the supply chains. The supply chains created a lot of the jobs for middle income people. The OEM anchored your economy. And GM would not only have the security for that billion, but they would lend it to the supply chain. So I went to the investment banker and I said, wow, that seems like a lot. I mean, these guys are lending $500 million in credit to their supply chain. And I'll never forget what this investment banker told me. He said, General Motors is the most powerful corporation in the world. Its balance sheet is better than the United States government. 10 years later, General Motors got bailed out. And after a massive tax cut, they began closing more plants in Ohio and Michigan. I mean, when you have more people at home collecting a paycheck than you have people working for you, that is a losing proposition. And that's exactly what's going on in the California pension system here today. So we had a little battle with that here in our own community when we worked with our urban center, passing Measure U and putting money into the poorest neighborhoods to elevate people. Who did that? It was the 44 CEOs in my organization that put the money and the time and the energy to make that happen. We agreed to tax ourselves for all the people being left behind in our community. Who was the first people at the table to take it? SEIU and the firefighters union. They got in line first. And if you look at the quotes of the firefighters, they are astonishing. They're shocking. They're shocking what they had the audacity, the level of entitlement in their mindset, that they didn't even feel like they had to share power with the poorest people in their community because there was a nickel on the table that they could get their hands on. I give Mayor Steinberg a lot of credit. He withstood that. We did a pretty good job at holding our own. And now there's going to be some economic development initiatives in the neighborhood. But more importantly, I talked to my board about this. And this is a big part of what I think we need to be thinking about more broadly. What do you want to do about this? We're going to get rolled. I don't have a firefighter SEIU union. I don't have a political action committee. We're a 501c3. We don't even endorse. I vote we drop the gloves. But you guys got to be good with that because it's going to be messy. So they were rolling the city council, and I had my first Donald Trump moment, you know. I just tweeted, if this happens, we're going to fund a repeal of the entire tax. And that's what we were willing to do. You can applaud that. That's exactly. So I made the mayor a little bit nervous, and I said, thank SEIU for teaching me how to organize in California, right? No shared power, no reasonableness, just a brinksmanship strategy. I'm holding all the cards, you're not. It's all going to go my way. None of it's going to go your way. And none of these conditions facing California are going to dissuade me. I'm not an anti-labor guy, but I am against government not being transparent, not being open, not setting goals, not solving problems. Absolutely. Absolutely. Because you know what? That's anti-democracy. That is an anti-democratic philosophy, and we have a responsibility and a right to stand up for the Constitution and call for our government to be transparent and responsive to our needs. So when I look at California going ahead, and I'll talk a little bit about this Economist report, which I think is very interesting. You know, what is our goal as a community? What are our plan and what are our strategy? And I really appreciated, Jack, your numbers, because what really worked on Measure U, and we'll probably have to fight it to the bitter end, was it was a coalition of CEOs, African-American leaders, neighborhood activists, Latinos, and homeless advocates. That was the coalition that beat labor on Measure U at City Hall. It's interesting, isn't it? What do we have in common? We weren't getting the pension, right? We weren't going to walk off into a sunset. I mean, imagine if you have a scenario where you're guaranteed 100% economic security regardless of the outcomes. You become less responsive to the outcomes. So this coalition was a very unique coalition. But it was a coalition that gave the council, with an 8-1 vote, the strength to turn back. I don't know how many times the firefighters in SCI have been beat at City Hall in this community or in this state, but we beat them. And we didn't beat them being business guys. We beat them by being leaders doing the right things. And this is what we need to do in California as a business community. We need to be the leaders that do the right things. And that's what built this country. When I look at other states, what they're doing, I looked at this Economist report. It was a tough report. It was tough to even read it, how the Economist wrote about us. But I think it's an opportunity for us because what the Economist wrote about was true, and now that's on Governor Newsom's watch. And Governor Newsom's a young man with a big future, possibly, and I think we should get on the governor's side as long as we're operating on the same values and we're going to get action and solutions. I've spent a little bit of time in the California legislature, not a lot. But when I go down to the legislature, I will tell you what they tell me. And if you talk to other people, please come down here more. Man, we need your help. When you're not down here talking to us, it's just the other side of this equation. It's really tough for us to go out and call for a more rational, free market plan for the state when the people that are there to champion it aren't in the room. And when we walk out, it's just our political base on the left calling for the dogma to be materialized. So in order for new leadership to be in California, we got to be at the table. So there's an old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And let me tell you, we are on the menu. And they're in line a third. It's a buffet. It's an all-you-can-eat buffet. They're not just coming by once. It's like a bunch of college kids. They just keep coming through, and their ability to eat is unlimited so far. So how do we create a shared value, like quality housing, quality neighborhoods? How do we create a shared value around education and schools? I love the inclusion message. So one of the things that I've used in our community on the economy, when Mayor Steinberg got elected mayor, this will probably surprise you. I'm actually friends with the mayor, and I've enjoyed working with him. The CEOs were not as excited about Darrell being mayor as some other people would be, right? So I went to the CEOs and I said, first off, don't presume everything he did in the legislature you didn't like. Don't presume he will do that as mayor. And if we have our own forward trajectory in a conversation or relationship, that's the best way to stop that from happening. The mayor stood up against labor to make sure Centene was able to go out with an open shop. It's going to be the largest single investment in the region in almost 30 years, 600 million, 5,000 jobs. He's helped us on Measure U. Aggie Square, the university's development, is real. And I think there's a path there, if we're at the table shouldering the burden of leadership. If we allow ourselves to be fragmented, if we allow ourselves to be peeled off. I've ran a lot of change agendas. You end up being really lonely because they pick your support off, right? You guys know what that's like. They buy your support off. That's what they do. When you're running a change agenda, they go in and look at your coalition. Well, we'll carve you out of labor laws, and we'll carve you out of this new policy, and we'll carve you out of this new policy. And tragically, business groups step out of the fight because they allowed themselves to be carved out of the leadership model by taking a single one-up experience and going back. That's the problem with a lobbying and a political mentality versus a leadership mentality. So I always like to say, not in the most draconian terms, I'm in a win-lose scenario. We either turn the greater Sacramento region around or we failed. There isn't any reason, certainly we don't want to be destructive, but there isn't any reason to stay in the white lines. There's nothing the governor can do for me. I don't want to point it to something. I'm not going to run for something. I want to see a change in the future of this region and a change in the future of California. And I really believe if we start thinking that way and sticking together as leaders, we can do it. But we got to bring more leaders to the table, and we got to bring more impactful leaders. And I will tell you what leaders follow. They follow bold agendas. So I think as long as we're playing defense, sitting back, playing catch up, it's going to be hard to get a Tim Cook or a Mark Benioff, or somebody of that magnitude to start to step in. I mean, we think about the plight of small businesses. That ought to be the number one objective of Salesforce. That's their clients. That's their business. Where is Mark Benioff on these small business matters? And how do we bring someone like that to the table? Because what he says really matters. So if you took all the muscle that's in the state legislature, how many billionaires are there in California? And I've said this to my board. Hey, this stuff happened because we let it happen. Make no mistake about it. We let it happen. Things were still pretty good. It's great to be in California. I love California. I'm not worried about myself. I'm worried about the people that can't get to a mic. I'm worried about the people that aren't educated. Yeah, I'm worried about the parts of my community that aren't getting a chance to be who they should be. Because I grew up in America, even though my dad had an 8th grade education, I grew up in a country where my parents were survivors of the Depression. My mom grew up in an orphanage. She was an Irish immigrant. I never heard my parents once tell me anything other than, this is the greatest nation in the world. Never. They didn't have nice things, They didn't have a big house. They didn't take vacations. They didn't eat out. They didn't have all the frills. But they remember when their country was really on the ropes in World War II. They remembered what it was like to fight the Depression. And when they looked out over the horizon, they thought, hey, this is pretty good. But more importantly, it was pretty good for their children. And they would always tell us, hey, we ended up this way because we grew up in the Depression. You're not growing up in the Depression. You're not going over to China in World War II. You're getting an education, and you can be anything you want in this country. So as Senator Warren and Senator Sanders go out and tell everybody the system's rigged, I find that amazing, because how did either one of them end up in the U.S. Senate if the system's rigged? It's like, hey, you look like you're doing pretty good for me for a rigged system, right? I mean, that's not too bad, a rigged system like that. Bernie, dang, you almost got to be president, or at least the nominee. It's pretty meritocracy from my perspective, right? But the irony is Stacey Abrams, the African-American woman who finished second for governor in Georgia, she's running a conversation in Georgia that when you say the system's rigged, it's really a suppression strategy for the poor and the neediest people. So on one hand, you've got a group of people saying the system's rigged that are leading that political conversation. On the other hand, in the same party, someone in the South is saying, when you tell people the system's rigged, that's how you suppress the poorest people. So if you're growing up poor in America and you're being told the system is rigged, what is your future? Well, it's rigged. That's why I'm down here. I have no chance out. Versus the kind of optimism that Ronald Reagan had and even Obama had, that you could be anything in America. And so I think we can take this mantle back and lead the conversation. And I talked a little bit about a couple of other things. And one of my, so the two kind of events that I've watched recently, in the Economist report, there's a high-ranking official that advises the governor, including the governor, who said CEQA was a problem. But you know what? You never heard Jerry Brown say that. No. So there's an opportunity if we're going to get a leader that's going to admit CEQA, yes, CEQA is a problem. I like to refer to CEQA as the 3 strikes you're out for community economic development, right? It really is. It's why we have an affordable housing problem. It's why we can't get corporate Class A office. And when we talk about this inland strategy, right, the governor's going to lead the inland economy to level off the coastal economy. And I talked to his chief advisor and I said, see if you can find somebody to build a building in Fresno, California. See if you can do it, right? I always say, Sacramento, we're Indianapolis at California prices. Indianapolis is a great town. But what would happen if Indianapolis had to swallow a 13.3% income tax or a 13% capital gains tax? What would happen if they would have to swallow these regulations and labor? There wouldn't be anybody in Indianapolis. So really, when you think about our community, we're doing quite well when you consider all the hurdles we have to achieve to get there. So Fresno's got 18% college educated. That's almost 50% below the national average. Grows at 4%. It's largely an immigrant community. It's going to 1 million people. Its primary economy is food and ag, the #1 target of regulators with climate change. Now, this is the place we're going to build an economy. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into their single economy that they have working for them, and we're going to suppress it and suppress it and suppress it. Now, I run into growers in the Central Valley that tell me California regulators have told them you would just be better off closing your farm and leaving our state. So now it's one economy is going to be under attack from climate change, and I'm not against the climate change conversation. And then you're going to have a 13.3% income tax and a 13% capital gains tax, and you're going to have a mid-tiered at best educational workforce, and you're going to build an economy in that community. Man, that's tough sledding. I'm telling you, that's tough sledding. So I have an old saying when it comes to political leaders. I got 2 relationships with political leaders. I'm here to work with you to solve our problems. But if you don't want to work with me to solve our problems, that's okay. Because now I'm here to hold you accountable for those problems. So you choose the relationship, partnership or accountability. I'm good with both. Thank you. So I read the LA Times, Los Angeles spent $600 million on homeless. Did you see that? It went up 16%. Oops, that's a bad deal. This is what happens when problems get unsustainable though, right? So you bail out General Motors, and then you give them the most aggressive tax cut in the history of the United States. And what do? They close 5 plants right in the heart of the Midwest that you're trying to bring back. Why? Because they're so structurally unsound with those pensions. So I really believe our best days are in front of us, but I do think the clock is ticking. And I think we need to step up and step up now. We need to be smart about it. We need to do it together. And I'm on board. So I'm going to close by thanking all of you for being here. I always say to my guys, you know, the CEOs on my board, because it's exhausting, right? Every legislative session, we get new things that exhaust us. No way in the world with the talent, the money, the resources, the intellect, the global reach, the capital, and the influence in California should the business community get beat by the government. No way. No way. We just got to make up our mind we're going to do something about it, and I think that time's right now. So thank you for having me. Good luck. Thank you for your leadership, and I'm looking forward to leading a new California agenda with you. Thank you.
Barry Broom, everyone. Tell you what, we were going to take a 10-minute break. It's going to be a 2-minute break. So we can move right along as we get our panel up here. I also just want to point out Senator Brian Dahl's here. Senator, thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it. So you have 2 minutes to grab a piece of cheese, a cold drink, and we're going to get underway here in about 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Roll and Prop 13 as well. So find your way back to your tables, and I will begin the introductions. On my far left, your far right, representing the National Federation of Independent Business, CA, as California, as their state director, Mr. John Kabatek. Let's hear it for John. Among the many things John has done is protect small businesses from higher taxes and more reg, fight split roll and Prop 13 reform harmful for small business, reducing onerous regulations that strangle job creators in the state of California, and stopping the shakedown lawsuits that typically target the mom and pops. In addition to service to 2 governors, he became vice president and senior legislative director for the California Restaurant Association. Now he has many clients. He's also counsel to the international law firm Alston and Bird. John Kabatek is here to answer some questions today. Thank you, John. In the middle, a native Californian graduate from UCD, law degree from the UCD School of Law as well. is Mr. Rex Hine. Let's hear it for Rex. Presidential California State Assembly rep on the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency. Most recently served as regent for the University of California. Involved in all statewide school construction bonds, serving either on the steering committee or the finance committee. Rex Hine is here today.
Yeah.
And finally, the man who's going to give us a quick overview of what we're talking about and lead us off. And by the way, each of our speakers are going to take 5 minutes to kind of talk about the one issue or the area of interest that they want to dive into. Then we're going to have a little Q&A and a little round table here back and forth. But Mr. John Capal, let's hear it for John if we could. President, Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. He's a graduate of Marshall White School of Law at the College of William and Mary, where he got his JD, and he served as an attorney with the Pacific Legal Foundation, specializing in tax issues and political law. Let's start off with John. Why don't you give us an overview, if you would, sir, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kelly. Pleasure to be here. It is amazing that all of you would take this much time out of your day, particularly because AOC tells us we've only got 12 years to live, and the fact that you take a couple hours out of your day when the clock is running out in the world, at least that's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tells us. I'm just going to give you a brief overview for a lot of young people here who probably don't know what Proposition 13 is, but very brief overview. Prop 13 was the beginning of the modern tax revolt movement in 1978. It took an average property tax rate in California of 2.6% and cut it to 1%. Very important provision, but it also limited the annual increases in assessed valuation to 2% a year. And that is the provision that has allowed homeowners to stay in their homes after they were being driven out of their homes by runaway inflation in the mid-'70s. Howard Jarvis had two major goals. The first goal was to allow people to stay in their homes. On that score, Proposition 13 has been a remarkable success. His other goal was to slow down the growth and accelerated growth in the size of government. And on that score, Prop 13 has been a failure. Prop 13 really did nothing to slow down the size and growth of government in the state of California. As we know, government is a growth industry and remains so in the state of California. Something that Proposition 13 did that very few people realize, that it actually saved local governments. How did it do that? It stabilized local government revenue because of that limitation on the annual increase in assessed valuation. There was a whole bunch of untaxed equity, and so when the real estate crash came, local governments still had a lot of revenue that they could use. So if you talk to your local county assessors, that's the one thing about Proposition 13 that the left never likes to talk about, and that is how well it's worked, not just for property owners, homeowners, and businesses, but how it has stabilized local government revenue for all municipalities in the state of California. Good news is, despite the leftward leaning of the body politic in California right now, this is not 1978. This is no longer the California of Ronald Reagan. We have a very, very progressive government, and people are far more progressive now than they were back in 1978. But even the PPIC poll indicated that Prop 13 remains remarkably popular to this day. If it were on the ballot today, it would pass by about the same two-thirds margin that it did back in 1978. And that is a testament. Jack talked about there's a bipartisan issue, and look, Prop 13 remains popular among Republicans and Democrats, and for people who want to keep their property. Now, we're going to talk about split roll, and split roll is not a pastry. Split roll is when a government starts treating property differently depending on the use. In other states, different kinds of properties can be taxed differently. I think Michigan has a lot, like 22 different rates, different rate for golf courses, different rate for parking garages. In California, we've had a unified tax roll since the 1800s. Proposition 13 did not provide a tax break, a loophole to businesses. We've always treated all property the same, and that's vitally important. It is a good policy position to have to treat all real estate the same for tax purposes. There's different ways you can split the roll. You can increase the rate on commercial property. So instead of that 1% rate, you could have a 2% rate. Not advocating that, but that's one way to do it. But what we have before us today is something different, and that is there is a measure that has qualified. The signatures have already been turned in. It's called the California Schools and Local Communities Funding Act, and fuzzy puppies. No, I made that last part up. But, you know, they always have some good-sounding initiative to try to fool you. But the way it splits the roll is that it takes away that one provision of Proposition 13 that limits the annual increases in assessed valuation to 2%. So commercial property would be reassessed continuously. So right now, for all property is reassessed when it changes hands. This is a radical departure from Proposition 13 as it is. It would be about a $7 to $11 billion annual tax hike on businesses. And so I frequently get the question of, okay, Jarvis, you guys represent mostly homeowners. Why are you out there defending the business community? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Number one, when businesses pay more taxes, then citizen taxpayers pay more for the goods and services that they purchase. And also, we know that if Prop 13 is attacked and destroyed for businesses, that homeowners are next. And Benjamin Franklin said, we either hang together or we hang separately. And we need to hang together when it comes to the defense of Proposition 13. The particular measure, you know, it is, number one, it's badly drafted. It's a big tax increase. As I said, Prop 13 did not create a loophole for businesses. That's what you hear all the time. There's this loophole that needs to be closed. No. Prop 13 is working exactly as it was intended. There would be huge negative impacts, economic impacts to split roll, higher prices, job losses. There's been a number of studies out there talking about the impact on businesses. And by the way, it is also universally detested by the county assessors, because if they have to continually reassess property to full market value, they're going to have to hire armies of new deputy assessors. And even assessors who do not like Proposition 13, like in Santa Clara, there's Larry Stone, the assessor down there. He is not a fan of Prop 13. He wants to split the roll by raising the tax rate. But this particular proposal that would require the hiring of thousands of more assessors is disliked by virtually every assessor I've talked to in the 54 counties in California. Just a brief note on the politics, and I'll hand it over to Rex to talk about the specific impacts. I think we can beat this thing. I know it's going to be 2020. The voter turnout models probably be very liberal, but Prop 13 continues to be popular. People are confused about this particular measure. In fighting split roll, we're going to wrap ourselves in the mantle of Prop 13 because it continues to polls well. And higher taxes are unnecessary. We have the highest income tax rate in America. We have the highest state sales tax rate in America. We now have the highest gas tax in America. And even with Prop 13, we're not a low property tax state. We rank 17th out of 50 states in per capita property tax collection. So we don't need the tax. This is a foolish policy. We don't need to give businesses one more reason to leave California, because we already have that problem of them leaving. And so now that I've mentioned businesses, I'd like to turn it over to Rex. Rex.
Thank you, John. And one thing we should recognize John for is he is a everyday warrior to protect Proposition 13. And the reason people today, no matter how old or how young they are, still like Proposition 13 is because John is out there in the fields and vineyards every single day preaching the gospel. Let's give him a big hand. Well, let me go over the measure just again a little bit. There's a couple of points I want to make. First off, I think you all know the governor has a $215 billion budget for California this year. $215 billion. We have a surplus of $21 billion sitting over here. That's on top of the $215 billion. And then we have the rainy day fund of $16 billion sitting over here. That's over here, not being touched. And on July 1, guess what happens to all of us? The gas tax goes up. Right. We're going to have another increase in the gas. They're just coming down a little bit. They're going to fake us out. We're going to, oh, I don't need to buy it yet. And then you're going to go there on July 2nd and go, oh my God, it's going to shoot back up. So buy your gas before the end of the month. My consumer tip of the day. The measure not only creates a situation where properties are reassessed, commercial properties are reassessed within every 3 years, as opposed to the protections they currently have, that we all have under Prop 13. But the other draconian thing it does is that all commercial properties in California, all business properties, have to be reassessed to a 2020 value. So I want that to sink in for a second. Right now, you get reassessed when you do something major to change it, or when you sell it and somebody else has that problem. Your property is going to be reassessed. So let's say you bought that property in 1990, or 1995, or 2005, or God forbid, 1980. And you've been paying on those taxes. Now you're going to suddenly get a bill for 2020 values with no preparation. Hello there, here it is. Just think about that. Let that sink in and think for a moment when you bought your property. Or think for a moment where you're leasing property when that property was bought. And all of a sudden you're thinking, wow, this is a bigger nightmare than I'd even thought. Because the rate of property values, I'll just tell you this much. The home I grew up in, which my parents bought when I was little, so it's really old, I think they bought it for like $17,500. They, big deal. We moved from the city to Terra Linda, San Rafael, California. And then they sold it in 1974. And everybody thought, wow, look at this. They made $47,000. They sold it for $47,000. That was a lot of money. Well, I went on Zillow because I was conversing with a high school buddy of mine who lives in Minnesota now for obvious reasons. And I said, you grew up in a richer neighborhood than I did. And he said, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. I said, yes, you did. Let's go on Zillow. So we went on Zillow, and I saw what the value of my home that I grew up in that hasn't changed and was built back in 1956, $983,000. By the way, his was $1.2 million, so he did live in a richer neighborhood than I did. Well, that's the sudden message that we're all going to be faced. And the other thing is, you don't get to pay property taxes monthly or in the little program. You pay them twice a year, and you pay them or you lose it. So here are some unintended consequences that they don't think about. Not only is this measure going to increase taxes significantly, they're going to drive small businesses out of business. Think of your favorite taco store that you go and you get that taqueria. Think of your favorite dry cleaners. Think of your favorite guy who runs that insurance company that you've been going to for the last 15 or 20 years. Guess what? They're gone. They're gone. Walmart will still be here. Target will still be here because they have a customer base large enough to spread that increase out over. The fact they have to meet, the taxes they have to meet. But the corner places don't. So they're all gone. And some of you are those that are going to be gone. And that to me is really scary and really frightening, and we shouldn't let it happen. What's another unintended consequence that they want to have happen? Well, guess what? Guess who invests in commercial properties? Pension funds. And a value of commercial property in California is certainty. Because I know what I'm going to be paying taxes for the next 20 years forever as long as I own that property and I don't do significant changes because I know how Proposition 13 runs. Well, when I'm now going to be reassessed every 3 years, I no longer have that certainty. So one of the great values of commercial property in California is certainty. That's gone. So there's going to be a devaluation of property values. What will that mean for the pension funds? They're going to be devalued accordingly. So that's another little side trip. That message, by the way, is something that we're using to try to drive a wedge between the private sector unions, those in the building trades, for instance, and the public sector unions who are pushing this. Because in reality, what this measure is all about is getting money into the underfunded pensions. 60% of this money, of the $11 billion, is designed to go to local government for pensions. They don't say that, but that's where it's going. 40% of it is designed to go to schools. For what? Pensions. They don't say that, but that's what they're going to go to. Now, you're all saying, wow, their messaging is this: it's good for the kids, it's good for the education, it's good for California, and it's good for the old people that live in the communities or whatever. We're not going to get in a debate over the education funding in California. We lose that debate. Our polling shows that if we start debating how much money is being spent on our kids, we lose. We're going to talk about over and over again the fact that it's the first stake in the heart of Proposition 13. And make no mistake about it, it is the first. They have no desire just to stop with the business side. They're going after the rest of John's members. That's you. That's exactly right. So those are some of the consequences that are out there. This morning, I already flew down to San Diego, spoke to the San Diego Chamber of Commerce, the BOMA down there, and they have some of the commercial real estate groups, and informed them about this. We did our overall presentation. We talked about the polling. We talked about our messaging. And our messaging is going to be protect Proposition 13. And we won't know the number of this measure until July of next year. So you won't have us talk about no on because don't want to waste any money. It's cost about $7 million a week to be on TV. And with the kind of turnout that we're going to have in California, with being an election year for the president, and we all know, unfortunately, how the turnout in those kind of years go with the rabid rousing folks, and the new voting habits, which is you get same-day voter registration now in California. You still have this ballot harvesting. You're going to have as much cantankerous crapola, pardon my French, that you've ever seen. So we're estimating that potentially there could be as high as an 80-plus voter turnout. Whether or not they're real voters, we'll never know. But we're doing a campaign based on that kind of statistic. And we believe we can win if we focus our message and we turn on the troops. And all of you need to become messengers. You've all heard about those folks who go door to door and spread the religion and spread Americanism. This is your day to be those warriors. You are the Paul Reveres of 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. John Kabatek, why don't you chime in on this?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Kelly, and thanks, Jack and Lou and everybody. It's great to be here. How y'all doing tonight? Are you fired up? Fired up to protect Prop 13. It's great to be here, and I appreciate it. I know John Kupal mentioned that split roll, just to clarify, is not a pastry. Ironically, though, the majority of our legislature is puffy and flaky, so that is a fact. But we have an opportunity, I think, to really make some change here. Let me just ask by a show of hands, for those of you who are in, how many of you have a small business or work in a small business? Raise your hand how many of you own the property that your small business is in? How many of you actually rent your property, are renting or tenants within the small business? Okay. That pretty much squares up with a lot of what we see within NFIB. Well, I'm going to take just a couple minutes here because I know we're really eager to hear from all of you, get some questions and thoughts. I mean, John and Rex and I have talked. We'd really like to kind of hear from all of you. But, you know, what this means to small business owners, I think what you will often hear from those who are really trying to poke holes through or completely eliminate Prop 13 is that, you know, don't worry. We're going to smack this to the big guys, the big property owners. Don't worry. Everybody's going to be okay. How many of you buy that? All right. I didn't see one hand. And that is true because, as we all know, these costs will be passed on. At NFIB, and National Federation of Independent Business, we found that and it's kind of emblematic by the show of hands here, 78% of our members nationwide rent their property. And I see some members like Alzada Knickerbocker, who owns the Avid Reader. Hi, Alzada. And I see some others around here. Manny Cosme, you're here in the room somewhere. And Jack Frost, you're a member. And so I think a lot of folks here think that really if you own your property, you're the only victims of Prop 13 being watered down. And that is patently false. There is something, as many of you may know, called a triple net lease that a majority of small businesses and tenants in commercial property are engaged in. And that is basically an agreement where the tenant agrees to pay, and they call it triple net because there's pay three things: all taxes, building insurance, and maintenance on property, in addition to other fees and services that are where there are costs. So you're going to pay. And I think at the end of the day, making sure that we're hearing from those of you about what the impact is. And of course, that ends up resulting in higher costs. You're either going to have to raise your prices or you're either going to have to cut. And one way or the other, that's going to affect small businesses. There are 99.2% of all businesses in California are small businesses. And this is one of the things people don't really understand is small businesses on average pay 3 times more to comply with taxes, 29% more to comply with regulations. And as many of you are familiar with, the issue of these ADA shakedowns. I see Diane Rogers, the Rancho Chamber. I know over in Rancho, we've had a lot of problems all over the place with these shakedown ADA lawsuits. California, 40% of the shakedown ADA lawsuits in America hail from California. And small businesses are the victims. So one of the things that we also found out is when we were polling our NFIB members, property taxes rank out of our problems and priorities that we do every year. Property taxes rank number 12 out of 75 problems that small businesses face every year. Ironically, the percentage of those who actually think that the property taxes are not a problem is 13%. But what we have actually found that really with this triple net lease, everybody's going to pay a price here one way or the other. And we have so many problems that our state's facing right now. Even the nonpartisan legislative analyst last year, when they were doing an analysis of the split roll, basically noted that raising business taxes relative to other states could, and I quote, influence some businesses' decisions about whether to expand in or move to California. So, folks, we have a problem here. I think with small business owners, what you're going to hear quite a bit from the other side as we look at both this year and certainly as we're going into next year, this Prop 13 debate will continue. And there will be those out there basically saying small businesses aren't paying their fair share and the business community isn't. That is not true. And again, what we have also seen is, and I know John and Rex regularly cite this, property tax revenues in California, a lot of people think haven't really grown much. Well, they've grown from when Prop 13 was first established and voted by voters, approved by voters, from $5 billion that year in 1978, and tell me if these numbers are correct, John, to an average of basically $66 billion in the 2017-18 year. So that's an average of 6.9% annual growth. So if you're going to hear folks out there saying, we got to get our fair share, there's got to be more revenue, we need that. Well, first of all, that's growing steadily over the years. Second of all, as you heard my good friend Rex mention, we have a multi-billion-dollar surplus. Why do they continue to try and reach into your pockets? It's ridiculous. And the third part of it is we already are a state faced with the highest gas, income, sales, and corporate taxes. So for them to basically say that we need to take this and treat, they're really looking to small businesses as an ATM. And the thing I deal with on the road quite often, whether it's a bookstore like Alzada's, a restaurant, an auto shop, what we hear from folks out there is they just keep coming to us. They see us as the nickel slots. They see it a lot easier than going to the tables. And it's easy because there's a lot more money in those nickel slots. So what we ask you all to do, I think we want to hear more from you, is the small business voice needs to be heard. We have a surplus. We're already paying the highest taxes in the nation. Revenue from property taxes has been growing higher. It's actually been growing faster than the overall growth in California's economy, which is at 6.1%. So for folks to be out there, you're going to hear this rhetoric. At the end of the day, what we want to make sure is that your voices are heard. What Jack is doing and Lou and Pro Small Business California State is miraculous and wonderful. And we're looking forward to more of these to come. And I know NFIB is out there as well every single day making sure that we're getting small businesses involved. But your stories are the ones that matter the most. In the media, in your legislators' offices, I know that may sound like we're stating the obvious, but they really need to hear that. And Barry was right when he said, you know, at the end of the day, if you're not being heard, there is the deafening silence and the one side is dominating the debate. So I know NFIB doesn't do that every day. We're fighting the good fight, but the more that we can build rooms like this, Jack, congratulations, and everybody, the more we can do this all over, but most importantly, the more you can all sign up. There are sign-up sheets, I know, for folks who want to be involved in this Prop 13 education campaign. We will have them. We certainly want to encourage you to be a part of it. I know you can certainly find them through Jack as well. But most importantly, be heard. correct the dialogue, make sure people understand you're already paying your fair share, whether you are the owner, the tenant, the consumer, and the customer of that small business. You're paying it at the end of the day, and jobs will be lost. But I appreciate it, and I will be here to hand out Rolaids afterwards. But thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Any of you guys want to chime in on anything you heard there?
Yeah, John's figures were right. California, the property tax roll, assessable property in California is now $5.75 trillion of assessable property. That's the value of real estate in the state of California, and that generates $65 billion. So that's what puts us at 17th in per capita property tax collection. So all this stuff about local government being starved for revenue, it's just total nonsense.
So if and Rex, why don't you address this? You mentioned messaging. You mentioned the popularity of Prop 13 across the state. What other pieces of the message will resonate? I mean, for example, if people know that it's just a backdoor, non-transparent way of fixing what we all know to be a broken pension system, is that something that resonates with everyone, or is there a big part of the populace that thinks, well, we got to pay for it somehow?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, just what else works? What else works? I mean, we're going to hear the same argument each and every time. But for example, I didn't know Prop 13 was as popular as it is across the board, not just in this room.
Yes, it was amazing. Our polling showed that in every category, Republican, Democrat, men, women, independents, on across, that it was averaged about a 60+% support for Proposition 13. And again, if they get their messaging out first, which is why what we're doing is so important, if their messaging gets out first that it's about the kids and we need to take care of everything, it's much more difficult for us to win. If we get out the messaging that, and our plan is to be talking about Proposition 13 and how important it is, and that any challenges to Proposition 13 have a very significant impact, we can win. I want to add, if I may, just a second, a little bit of the background of how this measure qualified, because I think it's very interesting and people should know this, because all of you get on your phones every day, and probably some of you play in Facebook. This was originally started by a group called California Calls and Evolve. They're front groups for some of the public employee unions, and they every year go out and try to circulate petitions, and they were shooting for the year 2018. They were circulating their signatures, trying to get their votes so they get all together, but they couldn't get enough signatures to qualify to be on the 2018 ballot. So they just continued on gathering, which you're allowed to do, and then qualify to be on the 2020 ballot. Well, even then, they were having a tough time of making the total number of signatures they needed, until a princess came along and gave them $500,000, $500,000, to help them do that last umph to get qualified to be on the ballot in 2020. So the reason they're on the ballot in 2020, the reason they qualified, is that the Zuckerberg Foundation gave them $500,000. Now you go, why would they do that? Aren't they a business? No, they are not. They are an organization that wants to be liked by everybody. And if that means the opinion leader types, they want to be liked by the opinion leader types, and they give money to causes that make them look good. So you can thank Facebook for making this be a vote we take next November.
Yeah, Kelly, you asked about the messaging, and I think Rex is right. It's got to be, first and foremost about Proposition 13. Now, pensions are a real big issue in the state of California for people who are political observers. You know that. That's probably not the lead message, although I will say in the last 20 or 30 years, people are beginning to be more educated about pensions because it's in the news more and more. The second tier, something above pensions, I would say, is it's going to cost you more, because we've got to counter the message that it's just going to be businesses. You've got to impress on people, well, what happens when Safeway has to pay more in taxes? What's that going to do to your groceries? So that you've got to find the things that are immediate connection to the voters. So it's Proposition 13, and it's going to cost you more, even though they say it's just corporations.
And Kelly, one of the things that we've done, you all remember the campaign last November about Proposition 10 on rent control. And it was a measure that when we started the campaign against it, showed it passing overwhelmingly. And so we went out and we focused on, we need to go out and get some untraditional groups, the non-traditional groups, to be the face of our campaign. So if you recall those commercials, you saw the GI Forum, you saw the NAACP, you saw groups that you wouldn't normally expect to be standing up. Because we met with their leadership and we explained, and we talked at great length about the fact that if rent control passes, where you live today is where you're going to live for the rest of your life. And they understood that. Well, if this change happens to Proposition 13, where you work today is where you're going to be working for the rest of your life. And we believe we're going to have a number of those same groups working with us to defeat that. Because you won't see this face on TV, ever. John will see to that. But we will be looking to have folks like you out in this room be interviewed and spokespersons and whatnot, because you have a very special message that resonates throughout California, and that is small business over and over again.
From the initiatives that you have seen that may or may not qualify for the ballot in 2020, is this the number one threat to small businesses?
Yeah, there's no doubt that this is the number one threat to small business. The other huge threat is there's two proposed constitutional amendments coming up through the legislature. They're called ACA 1, Assembly Constitutional Amendment number 1, and SCA 5, Senate Constitutional Amendment number 5. Both of those would lower the current 2/3 vote threshold for special taxes at the local level. So you'd see bonds and special taxes, including parcel taxes, pass with less than a 2/3 vote. That 2/3 vote at the local level is one of the few protections, it's one of the main protections that's in Prop 13. So that for us is as big a threat, but it's on the same tier as split roll, because they're all attacks on Prop 13 directly.
The other two current initiatives on the ballot are one to try to fix California's criminal system, which was broken by Jerry Brown. And please pay attention to that one and vote yes on it. The other one is that you might remember last year, the legislature decided to put bail bondsmen out of business. That also is going to be on the ballot. So if you believe they should have a right to have a business in California, you want to vote yes or I don't know which way you vote on it, because it's convoluted. Which way do you vote, Bob?
You vote no.
So you vote no if you want to say no to the legislature.
Correct.
Okay. Vote no.
John, chime in here if you would.
Well, we're talking about ballot measures, and I think we have some of the ballot measures of Christmas yet to come. But I think we can also look at kind of the ghosts of Christmas past in a good way. A couple successes we had. You heard, when you're hearing about, well, what's it worth? What's it worth? It's California, for gosh sakes. Well, meetings like this are helping. We can see, obviously, we got people fired up. That's great. But as we look in the rearview mirror, we have some victories to be very proud of collectively. And we actually also have a chance to look at the California landscape, even in not so traditional kind of right center communities, to see that we have people who just don't want property taxes and property messed with. They just don't. You mentioned Prop 10, and it was a great success. And as Rex said, we had so many non-traditional voices out there, which was wonderful. And I think with all of you, you're going to be those great voices, whether it doesn't have to be in the media, it could be to your local electeds, it could be just locally, just hosting some sort of a local event or activity to get voters understanding it and energized. But so Prop 10's defeat was a big, big win. I think a big win in terms of, and a really telling to us that property owners, renters, and others out there, they just don't want to be fooled. And they realize this is the wool over the eyes. And frankly, that defeat was big. The other one that you can look at just on a more local level is Measure EE down in Los Angeles. That was about a couple weeks ago, was soundly defeated by Los Angeles voters. It was an effort. It was a 16-cent per square foot parcel tax. $160 per thousand square feet on property. And voters rejected it. And people say, my God, right? Yeah, right? For those of you who... And tell them, go ahead. It was pretty bad.
They needed a 2/3 vote. They got 46%. And that's in Los Angeles, very, very progressive jurisdiction, so it can be done if it's organized and if you keep your coalitions together.
Yeah, I'm a financial advisor during the day. And sadly, there's not a family of means that comes through my office that does not ask the question, should I leave California? And I can give them the financial rationale, but of course, our lives are much more than finance. But I was telling my son the other day that 10 years ago, I had clients in one state, California. Now I have clients in 17 states. And I did no marketing anywhere else. This is Californians who have left. The great irony is, in my mind, is that some of the people coming in asking if they should leave are people who get pensions from the state of California. Because their income tax on that will be so much less if they're living in Nevada or Florida, which is amazing. Any last comments before we wrap this panel up? Yes, go ahead, John.
Well, Kelly, just to dovetail onto that, I think your point is a very good one. I actually remember talking to somebody here on K Street the other day who was works with one of the other associations, and he said, "You know how you create a small business in California?" I said, "No, tell me. I'm the small business guy." He said, "Open up a big business and wait." And it almost feels that way, but I would say that there is hope. We see some things with Measure EE, we see things with Prop 10, we see people fired up, and I think at the end of the day, the most important thing you can do is be heard. I think that there are, the challenge with small businesses, Kelly, though, is that, unfortunately, unlike a Waste Connections, a larger business that may actually find a place in Woodland, Texas, small business owner, a person who has a cookie store, an auto shop, a little small business, they don't have a reload department. They don't have the funds to be able to do that. So a number of folks tell me, I'm just landlocked here. I'm stuck. It's kind of like when you go to a sporting event, you're inside the sporting event, you can't bring that 6-pack of beer. You got to buy the $14 one. So it's kind of like, well, not that I would ever do that, but it is very much with small business owners that many of them feel, I don't have the resources to relocate, and these are my family. This is the lady in the front, the people who work for me. This is my extended family. How do I tell them I'm shutting my doors? So be out there making sure that's being shared as well.
Rex, last comment.
Just thank all of you, because the fact of the matter is that you're here, and unlike the public employee unions and the other side, they, at our expense, have meetings. We're having meetings with you. They get told to go to meetings. You volunteered to come here. And let me tell you, that's so important. And each of you are going to make the difference in November 2020. Thank you.
John, you want a last word?
Yeah, the loss of business out of California is very real. There are 3 people you should be following. Joel Kalkin, who is a demographer who talks about the business flight out of California. He writes for Wall Street Journal. Again, Joel Kalkin is one. And if you've all heard of Victor Davis Hanson, he writes a lot on California and the ills and the problems that we have. And then there's another guy, Joe Vranich, who used to live in California, who actually tracks the businesses that have left. He researches each one, and the stuff he writes is extremely depressing. So they do have a bar over there, so you may want to hit the bar after this. But those 3 guys write a lot. And if you want to learn more about pensions, Marcia Fritz is sitting right over there. She knows more about California pensions than anybody else in California. And so some people will move, Kelly, some people will move. I'm going down with the ship. I'm a big hiker, and I love the Sierras, and I'm a wine drinker. And in Kansas, no mountains, no wine, so we're staying here. Thank you.
Sounds good. Let's hear it for John, and Rex, if we could, for our first panel. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you all for coming. I think we've heard a number of times, it's not just enough to know a few things about this. You got to stand up and lead. Tell your story. Reach out to media. Those darn talking head. Oh, yeah, I'm a talking head too. But still, reach out to media. Let your story be told. This panel is going to focus on affordable housing and rent control. And we have 2 panelists this time around. First of all, we have from the VP for Litigation for Pacific Legal Foundation, Sacramento, Mr. James Burling. Let's hear it for James. He has argued appellate property rights cases across the U.S., including at the Supreme Court. Also, joining on this panel today, the President and CEO of the California Building Industry Association. Please welcome Dan Dunmoyer. He is committed through education, advocacy, and communication efforts to ensure that CBIA continues to be the leading voice of housing in California. He's been involved in the public and private sector for over 30 years. Which one of you gentlemen would like to lead off?
Okay.
Jeb, go ahead. It's all yours.
So I was reading one of my favorite books that I like to read the other night. It was a book about 30 years ago called Rent Control, Myths and Realities. Actually, I only read it for the pictures. Because this book, published about 30 years ago, had a series of about a dozen photographs in it. It was a photograph of inner cities, these torn out places that were just a mess, burned out buildings, abandoned properties. And the caption on each one of these dozen or so photographs says, burned out building in such and such a place, victim of bombing in the war or rent control. And you could not tell from looking at these photographs. You'd have to go to the back to see the answer. Was this property a victim of rent control or a bombing during a war? Well, like war, rent control has been around a while of various kinds and sorts, but fortunately, it's only a temporary measure because a 1921 case talked about rent control being adopted in Washington, D.C. and to some degree New York, but primarily Washington because of all the bureaucrats that had come in and all the war personnel that had come into Washington, D.C., creating a housing shortage. So rent control is adopted in Washington, D.C. for a 2-year period, and the Supreme Court said, you know, if we have an emergency, we can have rent control. Well, we've had an emergency every year now since World War I. It's routinely redeclared an emergency. But of course, we don't need an emergency for rent control anymore because it's such a good idea. Any economist that you talk to will tell you what a great idea rent control is. If you like to have a decrease in the amount of housing available, there are several aspects to rent control. One is vacancy decontrol. If you have a tenant, can you remove that tenant easily? Do you have to go through a just cause hearing? Is this going to be a hassle that you don't want to go through? Does the tenant have to do something absolutely horrible? And not paying rent's not necessarily a horrible thing, but does the tenant have to threaten you in some way for you to have a just cause eviction? Well, it becomes extremely difficult. And of course, this puts landlords in a bind sometimes that if you have a tenant who bothers your other tenants, who is constantly the source of police visitations because police enjoy speaking to this individual so much, your property becomes a nuisance property and you're caught between a rock and a hard place. If you don't get rid of the tenant, the police are going to be after you and try to take your property for that reason. But of course, if you do try to get rid of the tenant and there's vacancy decontrol, you have problems there. And the other aspect of rent control, of course, is the ability to keep rents low. Now, it doesn't seem like such a bad idea, but anybody who owns a single home or a private home knows what homes are. They are money pits for unexpected expenses, right? I just put in a new air conditioning system the other day. Now, if you have to do that on rental property, you want to be able to recoup your investment. If you want to make it into a nicer place, you want to be able to recoup that. But in some communities in California that have rent control, good luck going before the rent control board. Although allow you to have increases that keep track of the consumer price index, well, maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of that year in and year out. But as far as getting the rent board to understand what it actually takes to maintain property or even improve it and get your finances from that, well, good luck. So Pacific Legal Foundation's been involved in challenging rent control for a long time. And I'm just going to tell you one story about a case where we got this close to overturning rent control in California. It's a case where we looked at the Supreme Court had said that, look, if you can show that a law, a regulation fails to substantially advance a legitimate governmental interest, that could be grounds for overturning it as a violation of either the takings clause or due process clause. So we commissioned a study from an economist who looked at a series of rent control jurisdictions throughout California, compared a rent-controlled jurisdiction with a neighboring non-rent-controlled jurisdiction. And we looked at the demographics of the tenants in the non-rent-controlled jurisdiction versus a rent-controlled jurisdiction. And then we looked at the justifications given for the rent control ordinances. And without exception, every rent control ordinance was supposed to help the poor, the elderly, the disabled, those people that are socially and economically dispossessed, minority populations, people that have trouble making it in the American dream. These are the people that rent control is supposed to help. But in every single instance of our comparisons, we found that the people that lived in rent-controlled markets were generally richer, better educated, whiter, healthier than the people living in rent-controlled or than non-rent-controlled jurisdictions. And that is because people who have those attributes of success, people that have it made in the country, are more likely to have the stability in their lives to stay in a rent-controlled unit. And economists will tell you, rent control doesn't help anybody, with one exception, and I'll get to that in a second. Rent control simply is not a workable solution to our housing crisis. It causes landlords, or it causes builders not to want to build rental housing. New York City just passed, or New York State just passed a very sweeping rent control measure, basically wiping out all the reforms that they used to have as far as getting properties out of rent control. And the Wall Street Journal reported today that rent-stabilized apartment buildings are now dropping 20 to 45% in value overnight because of the rent control laws in California. So who does rent control help? It helps the politicians who use rent control as a vehicle for getting in office and staying there. Rent control is the way that we've had some politicians like Tom Hayden get a start in Santa Monica. Rent control is a way that some politicians will pander to people, realizing full well they've got to know that rent control doesn't work. Nevertheless, they will try to pass rent control. So we went to court with the argument that rent control does not substantially advance a legitimate governmental interest, and a court of appeal actually agreed, a case called Santa Monica Beach, and tossed out rent control in Santa Monica. Then the case went up to the California Supreme Court. California Supreme Court, in their ultimate wisdom, because of course they're wiser than you, me, and every economist that ever looked at the issue, they said, of course, just because rent control does not meet those stated purposes of the rent control ordinances, we know that rent control does substantially advance one legitimate governmental interest, and that is the interest of keeping rents low. Astonishing. And so rent control for a 4-3 vote was upheld in California. We are trying to get rent control, other opportunities to get at it. We just had an unrelated Supreme Court victory on Friday that said we can now go into federal court to challenge regulations that take away property rights. And we hope to be using that door. Thank you. You know you had a good decision when Kagan gets really sarcastic and nasty. So we had a great decision in that, and we hope to be able to use that to walk into the federal courthouse doors on some rent control measures in the future. Back to you. Or over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Let's give Jim another round of applause for those great comments. So Dan Dunmore with the California Building Industry Association. I just want to bring you up to speed on the current housing crisis in California and give you some insights that I hope you'll find both illuminating, slightly depressing, but some encouraging comments I hope to conclude with. First and foremost, I'm a native Californian. I was born in the beautiful city of Hollywood, and my father wanted to move from Hollywood to the small town of Hemet because it was so expensive to build in Hollywood. He was building homes in Hollywood for $15,000 a year, and he had no idea how anybody could afford to purchase a $15,000 home. That home, as Rex was giving his story, the home I grew up in Hollywood, which my dad sold for $17,000, sold for $1.7 million last year. So it gives you a sense of real estate prices. Moved to Hemet to build the first affordable housing units there. They're called apartments, and didn't have any of those in Hemet. And learned from a young age about what it's like to try to build property and build homes in California. Let's fast forward to today. I have now just two teenagers and a daughter who's 25. My daughter sat down with me, very smart woman, very capable, and she said, "Dad, I'd love to buy a house." And I said, "That's a great idea, Heather. You should do that." She said, I don't know how many people do this, but she's saving $20,000 a year as a 23-year-old. When I was 23, I was saving $20 a month if I was lucky. She sat down and figured out the calculation to buy a fixer-up in Oakland at the current rate of savings. She'll be able to buy a home when she's 39. She'll need to put a deposit down of $400,000 to purchase a fixer-upper, and that's assuming housing prices only go up 3%. And that's why I'm here today, and that's why this housing crisis is real. There is no future for housing for our children if we do not address the situation we live in. Now, one of the questions we're often asked at CBI is, well, why does it cost so much to build houses? Must be because you guys make so much money that, that's why it costs so much. So there's this novel concept. It's not hard to figure out. It's called Nevada, Oregon, Arizona, Utah. For some reason, people in those states have figured out how to build homes that are more affordable. And the primary reason why we cannot build affordably in California is the issue of delay and fees. It's really this simple. The policy issues here are not complicated. So delays. If you look at a piece of property in Nevada, I just cross over and go to Reno. You'll see where we're building a lot of homes over there. You look at a piece of land, you ask the question, what will the economy be like in Nevada in 20 months? And as a home builder and a developer, that's what you look at. When you look at a piece of land here in California, you have to ask the question of what will the economy be like in 20 years? So a large project in California is not uncommon for projects to take 20 to 25 years to build. Now, you don't have to all be as smart as Kelly is to understand from an investment perspective. If I tell you I can double your money in 1 year, you're interested. If I can tell you I can double your money in 25 years, you kind of walk away. And that's the challenge for us as home builders, is it's very complicated to build. The other question on why we can't build homes that are affordable are the issue of fees. So one of the big excuses that's come out of Prop 13 is a statement that, well, we as cities need to charge development fees. We need to charge you the right to build. And those fees, when my dad first started, were out enormous. They were $500 to $700 per home. Today, a cheap fee would be $50,000 per home. If you're in Livermore or Richmond, it's $157,000 to $200 in fees per home. Now, that doesn't take into account the engineering costs, the experts, the biologists, all the other people that come into bear. But it's really hard to build a home in California that most people can afford if the fees are that high. And the challenge also for us is that's just the fee side. The delay side includes bringing in biologists, bringing in experts. If you don't go very far from your little town called Lathrop, you're on the way to Stockton, there's this river island. You'll see this little development. In order to build there, they had to create a bunny habitat. You think I'm making this stuff up? So they didn't have enough bunnies. It's a very unique bunny. The problem is you think bunnies would have no problems creating their own habitats from everything I learned in biology. But for whatever reason, they had to spend $2.3 million to create a safer bunny habitat. Well, what does that mean? It adds $15,000 per home. And then you add in additional other fees, additional requirements. And all of a sudden, you're finding yourself as a home builder taking into account all of these costs. What we're doing as a society in an effort to pay for our pensions, pay for our other government programs, we're sinking all the costs of running a society into the new home. That does two things. It pushes the price of the home through the roof, but it also pushes the cost up of all the existing housing stock. So that, in other words, you see the price move up, supply goes down, costs go up. So as novel as this is, we build the exact same homes we build in California, in the neighboring states and in Florida and other states at approximately 60% less. The exact same architectural design, the exact same structure. The only thing different in the other states, besides paying $240,000 to $280,000 a home versus $780,000 to $900,000 a home, is you actually get more land in the other states. That's the only difference of the home that we build and we sell. So there are things that government can do. And so on the positive note, the good news is we have an interest in housing like we've never had in the California legislature and the governor's office. So we're very excited about the fact. The question now is, will people like yourself in this room rise up and say, hey, we have a housing crisis. What are you going to do about it? As novel as it sounds, one of the first things you need to tell the elected officials, and what I tell every day, it's called the Hippocratic Oath of Housing. Now, you all know about that. Hippocratic Oath for medicals, do no harm. Well, in the legislature, many times the solution costs money. And we're looking for solutions that cost less. So ask the politician, hey, don't vote for bills that add to the cost of housing. We're paying enough. The second thing is to look for ways to make it easier and faster to build homes. And that's going to also keep the cost down. So we have a governor who's committed to building 3.5 million homes in the next 8 years. We have never done that once. That's about 425,000 homes. Our record's 19 63, 331,000 homes. So he wants to build basically 50% more than we've ever built in 1 year. And he wants to do 8 years in a row. This year we're on track to 100,000. So we're down 325,000 from his goal. But God bless the governor for at least saying he wants to build a home. Because most local government politicians run on no more growth. And that's really our challenge. I believe local government should control their local communities, but the challenge is most people say, you can build. We need more homes, just not here. It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. What we need now are YIMBYs. Yes, in my backyard. Build it wise, build it smart, build it more affordably. We also have a lieutenant governor, Eleni Kounalakis, who is also has a representation. She's a former builder herself. So we have a governor, lieutenant governor who get it. I mean, to Gavin Newsom's credit, he has built 22 projects in California. He has been threatened by labor. He can empathize. Our legislature struggles a little bit more. We have a few legislators who really get it, but they haven't brought any bills to the governor that he can sign yet. So part of what we need you to do is just reach out to your local elected, Democrat, Republican. Last time I checked, Democrats and Republicans both need homes. And our goal is to get more people to, like yourselves, to ask the question of the local electeds. I don't care what your party stripe is. What actions are you taking to making it easier and faster to build homes? I'll conclude with this last insight about our challenge. And just to touch on what my colleague here has said, if you look at issues like rent control and more requirements, we do have this desire to have the greenest state in the planet. And that's a great noble goal. I applaud that. But we've taken it now to an absurd extreme. We've decided that we're more willing to add more regulations to the point where people can't afford to have a home. And that to me is not finding the sweet spot of environmental protection. That's just taking an excess to the point where your actions and your ideology result in absurd outcomes. You need to ask the question, maybe this isn't the right path to take. So I just urge you in that process to continue to ask and hold your politicians, your local elected officials, your statewide officials, and your state officials accountable in this effort. And we think together we can be part of a solution. Together we can find ways to lower the cost of building homes. And so my children, your children, or young people here, they have the opportunity to have a piece of the American dream, grow their net worth, and become a really productive and successful citizen. Thank you.
You guys stay right where you are. We neglected, first Kelly Brothers had to leave. So our MC is gone. So we'll take over here, but we neglected something that one of you, a gentleman here, brought to our attention, and we haven't offered you the opportunity to ask questions of these experts. So Ed Ring wants to ask a question, I guess. So let's conclude this, and Jack has a mic, which he will move around. So hold up your hand if you'd like to ask a question. But in the meantime, I neglected to introduce an old friend and somebody who's a fixture of this town for years, Winnie Comstock of Comstock Publication, Comstock Magazine. And so let's conclude the evening with about 7 to 10 minutes of your questions, and hold up your hand. Jack will provide the microphone, and then these two experts, Jim and Dan, will respond, and I'll sit up here with them and just occupy space.
Thanks, Lou.
Okay, we have a question from Ed Ring, California Policy Center.
I wanted to ask you about something that doesn't seem to come up very often, which is the choice of just pursuing infill, smart growth, densification, something Joel Cochran writes about a lot. Seems to me, even if you break the NIMBYism and cram all this high density into the footprint of existing cities, you still may not really be able to take enough pressure off the market to bring prices down. So how do you come up with a way to make it possible to develop houses on open land again?
So a couple thoughts there. You're right. You're totally right. One of the, there's a lot of push to build in for environmental purposes and to build up. The challenge, as you know, when you build a single-family detached home, it costs about 1/7 if you build a 10 or 15 or 20-story apartment building. You have to have so much more cement and steel for good reason, seismic reasons and others. So a single-family residential home built in the burbs is not only a great American place to live, and what even our millennials are we have more purchases of millennials of our product than any other group of people, even though they're told they all want to live inside the city. Once they have a baby, they don't. So what we found is we want to build up, but that when you build up beyond 3 floors, the price goes through the roof. So you need both. You need to, for the people who can afford $1.5 million to $2 million home in San Francisco, God bless them, and they have every right to have that home. But for somebody in Roseville or Rockland or a neighboring community, right now, affordable is $530,000, which blows your mind. But if you could build in these other areas, you can get homes in California down to in Bakersfield and Fresno, 320, 330. So you need both. You're not going to hit the needs of the state unless you look at infill and you also look at suburban areas. So to us, it's all the above. And the numbers, the growth of population, even though we have people migrating out to spend their pensions outside of California, we still have a lot more births in the state. We're still a growing state. So we need to have both those opportunities of infill, but also what we call greenfield or suburban building to achieve it. Just one little fact, only 8% of California is built out. So a lot of people are like, wow, we're really getting big. But if you really drive the state, you've got a number of areas. If you do a master plan community like Tejon Ranch, for example, you can have jobs and places to eat and schools. You don't even have to leave your community. So if you allow the builders and developers to plan those master plan communities, it's not about urban sprawl, it's about a better quality of life.
And if I could just add, to get there, you look at a place like Tejon Ranch and look at how many decades that litigation has going on endlessly. Deals are made, then deals are broken. As long as we have a legal system here in California that makes it so incredibly difficult and expensive to build something in any reasonable amount of time, you can look at infill, you can look at outfill, but I think most people are going to be looking out of state if they want to have a home.
That's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to keep them in the state, for Christ's sake.
I'd like to get you gentlemen's opinion on this, and I wish the previous panel could have joined. My question is, in your opinion, twofold. How do we get more people in the room, more people to wake up to what's going on in the state? Number one. And number two, how do we get people to read the Constitution and realize we're getting taxed to death, and it's against the law. It's not even supposed to be this way. And here we are paying all these taxes.
So how do we educate people outside this room? I guess there are a lot of cliches, but I think the first one is that people hear you start to have to talk to your neighbors. Those neighbors who think things are just fine the way they are, those neighbors who haven't read the Constitution, read it yourself and then talk to your neighbors about, hey, this Prop 13 thing, it's pretty important to me and it's pretty important to you too. Do you have any idea what you'd be paying in taxes if it weren't for that? Get involved, and when you vote, not only vote for your legislators, look at the judges you're electing as well. They make a tremendous difference in what we do.
Yeah, just a few other thoughts on that. I mean, it really does come down to education. I find myself every year sending out emails on what are the ballot propositions, what do they really mean? A yes vote means no, a no vote means yes. I get confused. So being an informed citizen, it's amazing how many people say, hey, could you just tell me what you're going to do? And your circle of friends, can't use Facebook now, but your other tools you can use, email and other things, Twitter, do communicate through those tools and those resources. I think the other thing, too, on the educational side, it is difficult sometimes to get information on various judges and various forums. But again, if you create a circle and a coalition, and I know that's very much what Lou and Jack want to do, invest in this organization and bring more people into it. You have the foundation laid today by two great leaders, and we just need to be more a part of this, because this is the infrastructure. If you remember, the original revolution wasn't done by some large corporation. It was done by citizens rising up together saying, this taxation without representation, well, it sounds like we've come full circle, and many of us in this room feel we are not represented when it comes to the taxation we're paying. And that, to me, is what makes a big difference.
Okay, we're going to do one more last question, because one of our goals was to get you out of here at 7 o'clock. So we have one more question, and then Lou and I are going to wrap it up.
Hello, my name is Andy Calleroy. My buddy and me, we come from a place which is similar to California. It's the agricultural food basket of India. California is the agricultural food basket of the USA. and the rest of the world. Why are we building houses on agricultural land? There's a lot of land that's not agricultural. Why can't we build there?
A couple reasons why it's interesting. So one, plants don't sue. Cows don't sue. I'm serious. So just to back up what Jim's saying, when we try to build infill, the environmentalists will say, Dan, you should build more inside the city and less in the agriculture areas. And yet 75% of our CEQA lawsuits are in inner city construction. And so when we go out to the suburbs, there will be some people, Center for Biological Diversity keeps on holding up the Taylor Ranch Project and others, but a lot of this is just, it's easier to build and it's more affordable to build. What we can do though, and working with some of the farm community, there's a lot of land in California that's amazingly prime agricultural real estate. We shouldn't build on it. But there's a lot of land that's actually fairly desert. I mean, it's nice. It's not 120 degrees desert, but it's not good farmland. And there are ways as a community you can come together and plan out so you maintain your best agricultural land and you use the land. I mean, if you get enough water, enough fertilizer, you can grow anything, but that's not really agricultural land. So there are ways to develop a community and master plan a community to protect your good farmland, use kind of the dry land and clay land for building homes. That's a good foundation for homes. Clay is, it's solid, it's more firm. And so we're trying to do that more with some of the different organizations that have what we say is creative ways of farming and creative ways for managing our land. And we frankly have enough land to do that. So, but it is that balancing. It's ironic that we get sued more for building inside the city of Sacramento than we do in Roseville or Rockland, just because that's where the lawsuits are.
I want to answer the question that was asked over there about how do we get this message spread around. I want you to know that the gentleman to my left was taller than me 5 weeks ago. And nice try. And let me tell you, he has made this, along with Lou and a couple others, the success it is. And what we need to do is to have other folks be willing to involve themselves, like Jack has, to make a difference in California. That's how we get other people involved, and that's how we make a difference. Thanks, Jack.
I have a feeling that plug's going to cost me a couple $100. Thank you. So thank you all for coming. I'm sure Lou has a couple comments, but I want to make a couple before I kind of hand it over to him to close it out. Eric Blue and his team are videotaping this whole event. We've done some interviews with quite a few business leaders and some community government leaders. And the video is going to be posted on our website, but we're also going to be doing segments of this on our YouTube channel. So for those of you that want access to this information, go to prosmallbizcalifornia.org. Send me an email. You've all got my email. It was plastered all over the place. You've got my cell phone. So the video is going to be posted. Second thing is, we want you to sign up for our Bottom Line newsletter. And so that sheet is on every table. If you haven't signed up yet to get the Bottom Line report, you're really going to want to get that. And I know there was a third thing, but at my age, sometimes 2 is like the magic number and you can't remember what the third thing was. Well, maybe I can look at my notes. What was the third thing? Oh, yeah, I forgot. We're building an army. And the Army needs rations, right? We need money to pay for the bullets and the rations. So that sheet that's on the paper on the table that has the contact information, if you want to send a donation, we're not looking for $1,000. We're, 25 will work. Send whatever you can, a nickel, a dime, 50-cent piece, whatever you can afford, so we can keep moving this army and growing this army and fighting for your best interests. So thank you so much for coming out. I think it was a great event. You're going to be getting invitations to the next ones. So if you think this was great, we hope you'll support the ones that we're doing in the future. And I'll turn it over to Lou to close.
Thank you, Jack. And this is the spark plug who's going to keep this thing moving. And we're talking with people throughout the state to have similar events and to build the strength of small business and small business employees. And those that have been watching the national scene, the folks in some of the other issue areas of infanticide and 9-month abortion is going to bring a lot of people to the table that have been not in the table for the last few years. So there's a lot of dynamics going on, and we're simply going to focus on what you can do and how we can help you do it, and let some of these other interests come alongside us. So again, our thanks for your time and for your attention, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you so much.